The thing I remember most about the beginning is not the fear. It's the smell of antiseptic on my hands at 6 in the morning, the fluorescent lights buzzing the way they always did when the ballast was going bad in exam room 2, and the sound of Mrs. Huang coughing behind the thin partition while I prepped her nebulizer treatment. That's what the beginning of the end of the world smelled and sounded like for me. Mundane. Ordinary. A Tuesday. I had been working at the Millbrook Family Medical Clinic for just over 3 years by then. It was a small place, not a hospital, not an urgent care, just a quiet community clinic on the edge of a town that didn't quite qualify as suburban and wasn't rural enough to be called country. We had 8 exam rooms, a small procedure room, a modest pharmacy closet, a break room with a refrigerator that everyone complained about but nobody cleaned, and a waiting area with 16 chairs that were almost never all occupied at once. Our staff was small. Dr. Annalise Patel was the primary physician. I was the clinic manager, which sounds more impressive than it was. I handled scheduling, supplies, insurance paperwork, and basically anything that fell between the cracks. We had 2 nurses, Grace and Tomas, a part-time receptionist named Dana, and a medical assistant, Reggie, who had only been with us for about 4 months. I mention all of this because the building itself and the people inside it became the entire geography of my survival for the next 19 days. Everything I did, every decision I made, happened within roughly 4,000 square feet of single-story commercial construction. There was no dramatic escape, no cross-country journey, no convoy of armed survivors. There was a clinic, and there was me, trying to keep the people inside it alive long enough for the situation outside to become something other than fatal. The first signs came in the way that most catastrophes arrive in a medical setting, as symptoms. We'd had a slightly unusual Monday. 3 patients in the afternoon had come in with similar complaints: high fever, confusion, and unusual aggression or agitation. One of them, a man in his 50s named Gerald DuPont, had become so combative during his exam that Tomas had to physically hold him while Dr. Patel administered a sedative. That sort of thing happened occasionally. Disoriented elderly patients, people in diabetic crises, acute psychiatric episodes. But 3 in one afternoon was unusual. Dr. Patel had mentioned it at the end of the day, almost offhandedly, while signing charts. "Weird cluster," she said. "Maybe something environmental. Keep an eye on it." By Tuesday morning, the news was starting to carry strange stories, but I hadn't been paying close attention. I was focused on the schedule. I'd arrived at 5:45 to handle some prior authorization forms that were overdue, and by 6:15 I had the lights on and the building warming up. Grace arrived at 6:30, then Tomas. Dr. Patel came in at her usual 7. Dana was scheduled for 8, and Reggie for 8:30. Mrs. Huang was our first patient, a standing Tuesday appointment for her COPD management. The first thing that nudged my awareness from routine into unease was a call from Dana at 7:50. She said she wasn't going to make it in. Her neighbor had been taken away in an ambulance during the night, and there were police cars still parked on her street. She sounded shaken, which was unlike her. Dana was in her 60s, had raised 4 kids, and generally spoke about everything with the flat pragmatism of someone who'd already seen it all. But that morning her voice had a thinness to it. She said there had been screaming. Not argument screaming, something else. I told her to stay home and stay safe, though at the time I wasn't entirely sure what I meant by safe. It was just something you said. Reggie never showed up at all. He didn't call. I tried his cell twice and got voicemail. By 9 o'clock, we had seen 2 patients. The waiting room, which should have had 4 or 5 people in it by then, was empty. I stood behind the reception desk and looked out through the front windows at the parking lot and the road beyond it. Traffic was lighter than it should have been. Not absent, just thin. A police cruiser went past at a speed that was faster than patrol, but not quite pursuit. Then another one, going the same direction, about 2 minutes later. I didn't say anything to anyone yet. There was nothing concrete to say. Dr. Patel came out of exam room 4 at around 9:15 and asked me if I'd seen the news. I hadn't, not since the night before. She showed me her phone. There were reports, scattered, confused, contradictory, of widespread violence in several cities. Not protests, not terrorism, at least not in any recognizable form. The word outbreak was being used, but hesitantly, the way journalists use a word when they aren't sure it's the right one, but don't have a better option. Some reports mentioned a disease. Others mentioned attacks. A few mentioned both in the same sentence, as if the two concepts had merged. We stood there in the hallway, the two of us, reading different articles on our respective phones for about 10 minutes. Grace joined us, then Tomas. Nobody said the word zombie. That word didn't enter our vocabulary until much later, and even then it felt wrong, like putting a Halloween costume on something genuinely terrible. What we understood at that point was simpler and more frightening in its vagueness. Something was making people extremely sick, and those people were becoming violent, and it was spreading. At 9:30, I made the first decision that I believe saved my life. I locked the front door. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. I didn't announce it. I simply walked to the front entrance, turned the deadbolt, and flipped the sign from open to closed. Then I walked to the back entrance, the one that led to the small staff parking area, and locked that too. I checked the emergency exit near the procedure room. It was the kind with a push bar that alarmed when opened. That one was already secure. When I came back, Grace was looking at me. "Are we closing?" she asked. "For now," I said, "until we know what's happening." Nobody argued. That surprised me a little at the time, but in hindsight, I think everyone had been feeling the same low hum of wrongness that I had. The empty parking lot, the thin traffic, Dana's voice on the phone, the silence where Reggie should have been. Locking the doors didn't feel like panic. It felt like catching up to what the morning had already been telling us. Dr. Patel agreed with the decision immediately. She was not someone prone to alarm, but she was analytical, and the data, even the fragmentary, unreliable data we had, was pointing in a direction that made staying open feel reckless. We had no security. We had a glass front entrance. If even a fraction of what the news was describing was accurate, a medical clinic full of supplies would become a target, either for desperate people or for whatever those sick, violent individuals had become. There were 3 patients in the building at that point. Mrs. Huang, who was finishing her treatment, a young man named Kevin who was waiting for blood work results, and an older woman, Patricia Wen, who had come in for a blood pressure check and was sitting in exam room 6 reading a magazine, apparently oblivious to everything happening. I spoke to each of them individually. I explained that we were closing early due to a developing situation and offered them the choice to leave or to stay until things became clearer. Mrs. Huang's daughter was supposed to pick her up at 10. Kevin wanted to leave. Patricia, once I explained what the news was reporting, became very quiet and said she would prefer to stay, if that was all right. Kevin left at 9:45. I unlocked the front door for him, watched him walk to his car, and locked it again behind him. He drove off toward town. I never saw him again. Mrs. Huang's daughter arrived at 10:05, and the same process repeated. Unlock, watch, relock. After that, it was the 5 of us. Me, Dr. Patel, Grace, Tomas, and Patricia. The next 2 hours were spent doing what I can only describe as quiet preparation, though at the time I didn't frame it in those terms. It felt more like restlessness channeled into productivity. I walked every room of the clinic and took mental inventory. I noted all the windows. There were 12, most of them the narrow, horizontal kind you see in commercial medical buildings, not easily opened, and not large enough for an adult to climb through. The 2 larger windows were in the waiting room, flanking the front door. Those concerned me. They were plate glass, not tempered, and they faced the road. If anything was going to breach the building, it would come through there. Tomas, without being asked, started moving furniture. He was a quiet person, broad-shouldered, formerly in the Army Reserves, and he had a way of assessing physical situations that I came to rely on heavily in the days that followed. He took 2 of the heavy filing cabinets from the records room and positioned them behind the front windows, not flush against the glass, but a few feet back, creating a barrier that would at least slow anything coming through. He and I then took the waiting room chairs and stacked them in 2 rows behind the cabinets. It wasn't a fortification. It was a speed bump. But speed bumps matter when seconds count. Grace busied herself with inventory. This was instinctive for her. She was a list maker by nature, the kind of person who labeled everything in her refrigerator at home with dates and contents. Within an hour, she had a complete accounting of our medical supplies. Bandages, sutures, antibiotics, analgesics, a modest stock of prescription medications in the pharmacy closet, surgical gloves, antiseptics, saline bags, and the contents of the sample cabinet where pharmaceutical reps left trial medications. We had 2 AEDs, an oxygen tank that was about 3/4 full, and a small emergency kit that included an epinephrine auto-injector and basic trauma supplies. What we did not have much of was food and water. The break room had a water cooler with a 5-gallon jug that was about half full, a case of bottled water that someone had bought for a staff birthday party the previous week, a bag of pretzels, 2 cans of soup that had been in the cabinet since before I started working there, a jar of peanut butter, some stale crackers, a few packets of instant oatmeal, and whatever was in the refrigerator, which turned out to be 3 yogurts, a Tupperware container of someone's leftover pasta, an apple, and a half-empty bottle of coffee creamer. That was it. 5 people. That amount of food would last, if strictly rationed, maybe 3 days. The water was a bigger concern. The building had running water, but I had no idea how long municipal services would continue. Grace filled every container she could find, specimen cups, basins, the mop bucket after scrubbing it out, and stored them in the back hallway. Dr. Patel made phone calls. She tried the hospital first. The line was busy. Then it rang endlessly. Then it went to a recording that said all circuits were experiencing high volume. She tried the county health department. Same result. She tried 911. A recording thanked her for her patience and said all operators were currently assisting other callers. She tried her husband. He picked up on the second ring. I couldn't hear his side of the conversation, but I watched her face. It didn't change, which told me she was working hard to keep it from changing. When she hung up, she said, "He's at home. The kids are with him. He's going to stay inside." Then she went into her office and closed the door for about 10 minutes. When she came out, she was composed and ready to work. I want to be clear about something. At this point, by late morning on that first day, I still didn't fully understand what was happening. None of us did. The news was fragmentary. Cell service was becoming unreliable. Calls would connect and then drop, or not connect at all. We could still get some internet on our phones, but the information was chaotic. Government statements were vague. There were videos circulating that looked like they could be real, or could be elaborate fakes. The word infection kept appearing. So did aggressive behavior, loss of cognitive function, and unresponsive to communication. But there was no single authoritative source saying clearly and plainly what was happening and what to do about it. What I did understand, with increasing clarity, was that outside was becoming more dangerous and inside was relatively safe. That calculation, simple as it sounds, became the foundation of every decision I made for the next 2.5 weeks. I didn't need to understand the full picture. I needed to understand the immediate equation. Risk outside versus safety inside. And every piece of information that trickled in pushed that equation further in the direction of staying put. The first real scare came at around 1 in the afternoon. We heard a car alarm go off somewhere nearby, then shouting, then a sound I'd never heard before and hoped never to hear again. A kind of guttural, wet howling that didn't sound like anything a person should be able to produce. It went on for maybe 15 seconds, then stopped. We were all in the break room at that point, eating a small, carefully portioned lunch. Everyone froze. Tomas moved to the window first. He went to the narrow window in exam room 3, which faced east toward the sound. He stood to the side of the frame, which I later learned was a habit from his military training, avoiding presenting himself directly in the window. After a moment, he came back and said, "There's a man in the road. He's just standing there. Something's wrong with the way he's standing." One by one, we each looked. I was the last to go. The man was maybe 200 yards away, on the main road. He was standing in the center of the lane, slightly hunched, his arms hanging in a way that didn't look natural. Not at his sides, but sort of forward, as if he'd forgotten how to hold them. His head was tilted. He wasn't moving, but there was something about his stillness that was worse than movement. He looked like a machine that had been paused, not shut off. Like he could start up again at any moment, violently, without warning. We pulled back from the windows. Dr. Patel said, very calmly, "No one goes near the windows unless necessary. If we can see them, they can potentially see us." It was a rule we held to with near religious discipline from that point forward. The rest of the first day passed in tense quiet. We turned off the overhead lights in the front rooms and relied on the natural light that came through the narrow windows, supplemented by a desk lamp in the back hallway, where we established what became our main living area. The exam rooms had no windows except for rooms 3 and 7, so we designated rooms 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6 as sleeping quarters. Grace and Patricia shared room 5. Tomas took room 2. Dr. Patel took her office. I took room 4, partly because it was closest to the back entrance, and I had appointed myself the unofficial night watch without really discussing it with anyone. That first night was the longest of my life, and not because anything happened. It was long because of how little happened. I sat in the dark hallway between the exam rooms, listening. The building made its own sounds. The hum of the HVAC, the occasional tick of pipes, the subtle creaking of the roof as the temperature dropped. Outside, the sounds were sparse, but each one carried enormous weight. A distant car horn that blared for 30 seconds and then stopped mid-note. Dogs barking in erratic, frightened patterns. At one point, what sounded like gunshots, 3 or 4, spaced unevenly, from what I guessed was a mile or more away. Then silence. Then more silence. Then the kind of quiet that makes you realize how much ambient noise the world normally produces, and how its absence feels like a physical thing, a pressure on your eardrums. I didn't sleep that night. Not out of fear exactly, though fear was certainly part of it. I didn't sleep because I was thinking. I was running through scenarios. What if the water stops? How long can 5 adults survive on what we have? What if someone gets sick actually sick, with something ordinary, like an infection or an asthma attack? What if someone comes to the door? What if they need help? What if they're dangerous? What if we can't tell the difference? What if the power goes out? We had no generator. The building's climate control, refrigeration, lighting, all of it depended on the grid. Without power, the clinic became a dark box that would heat up fast in the afternoon sun. I made a list in my head, not a plan. I didn't have enough information for a plan. Just a list of priorities. Water first, then food, then security, then information, then morale, though I didn't think of it in that term at the time. I thought of it as keeping people from doing something impulsive. The second day brought a change. The power flickered at around 7 in the morning, went off for about 10 seconds, came back on, flickered again, then stabilized. I took that as a warning. Within an hour, I had moved everything temperature-sensitive from the refrigerator to a cooler that we packed with ice from the small freezer in the break room. Grace and I identified which medications needed to stay cool and prioritized those. Dr. Patel sorted the pharmacy closet into categories: essential, useful, and non-critical. The essential list was short but important. Antibiotics, insulin, we had a small stock for emergency use, epinephrine, and a few critical maintenance medications. The internet went out sometime around midday on day 2. Cell service had been intermittent since the previous evening, and now it dropped entirely. Our last reliable piece of information came from a news broadcast that Dr. Patel had managed to load on her phone before the signal died. It said that the National Guard had been deployed to several metropolitan areas and that residents were advised to shelter in place. It said that the infection, they were calling it an infection by then, was transmitted through bites and possibly through fluid contact. It said that infected individuals displayed extreme aggression and significantly diminished cognitive function. It said that there was no known treatment. That was the last outside information we received for 11 days. The loss of communication changed the psychological landscape of our situation more than almost anything else. When you have information, even bad information, you have context. You can place yourself in a larger picture. You can believe that someone, somewhere, is working on the problem. Without information, you are alone with your own perceptions, and your perceptions are limited to what you can see from a narrow window in exam room 3. What we could see over the following days was a gradual emptying. The road traffic decreased to almost nothing. We occasionally saw vehicles moving at high speed, loaded with belongings, heading out of town. We saw a few people on foot, moving quickly, carrying bags or pushing carts. Once, on day 3, we saw a family, parents and 2 small children, walking along the shoulder of the road. They were moving fast, the father carrying the smaller child, the mother holding the other by the hand and almost dragging the child to keep pace. They passed out of our line of sight within a couple of minutes. Grace wanted to call out to them, to offer them shelter. We discussed it briefly, urgently, in whispered voices. Tomas said no. Dr. Patel said she understood the impulse, but agreed with Tomas. I said nothing, which was its own kind of vote. Grace looked at me with an expression that I still think about sometimes. Not anger exactly, but something close to grief. As if watching that family pass without offering help had cost her something internal, something she couldn't easily get back. She was right to feel that way. But I also believe we were right not to call out. Every additional person was additional water consumption, additional food consumption, additional noise, additional risk of someone being infected and not yet showing symptoms. The math was merciless, and it didn't care about compassion. I carried the weight of that decision, and I still do. but I would make it again. By day 4, the power went out and did not come back. I had been preparing for this, mentally if not practically. We had limited battery power. Our phones, a flashlight that Tomas kept in his car and had retrieved on day 1, and a small battery-powered radio that Patricia had in her purse, of all things. The radio became our most valuable possession. We kept it off most of the time to conserve batteries, turning it on twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, to scan for broadcasts. For the first 2 days after losing power, we got nothing but static. On the evening of day 6, we picked up a faint broadcast from what sounded like an emergency station. The message was automated, looping. "This is the emergency broadcast system. Shelter in place. Do not travel unless directed by authorities. Avoid contact with infected individuals. Aid stations are being established. Stand by for further information." It repeated every 90 seconds. We listened to it 3 times, then turned the radio off. The loss of power created immediate practical problems. The building's ventilation stopped, which meant that within a day the interior temperature began climbing. We were in the middle of a warm stretch of weather, and the clinic, with its flat commercial roof and limited insulation, became stuffy and then genuinely hot by the afternoons. We opened the narrow windows on the side of the building that faced away from the road, just enough to allow airflow, but not enough for anything to get through. Even so, the heat was draining. It affected sleep, concentration, and mood. Water consumption increased, which accelerated our most critical supply problem. I had calculated, conservatively, that our water supply would last about 5 days with strict rationing. By day 4, when the taps ran dry, confirming that the municipal water system had failed, we were already on day 3 of rationing. That meant we had roughly 2 days of water left. This was the first moment when I felt genuine despair. Not as an emotion, but as a mathematical conclusion. 5 people, 2 days of water, no clear resupply, and a world outside that was hostile in ways we couldn't fully predict. Tomas suggested a run. Not a long one, just to the small convenience store about 400 yards down the road, on the same side of the street as the clinic. He'd been watching it from the window. The store appeared to be abandoned, its lights off, its door possibly ajar. He proposed going at dawn, when visibility was good but activity from the infected seemed lowest. We had observed, over several days, that the infected appeared to be more active at night and in the late afternoon, though this pattern wasn't perfectly consistent. Morning seemed to be the calmest window. We discussed it that evening, all 5 of us, sitting on the floor of the back hallway in the dark. It was the most serious conversation we'd had since locking the doors. Grace was against it. She felt the risk was too high. Patricia didn't voice a strong opinion, but was visibly frightened by the idea. Dr. Patel asked practical questions. How long would it take? What would Tomas carry? What was the exit strategy if he encountered infected individuals? I listened, and then I said that I would go with him. My reasoning was not heroic. It was logistical. 2 people could carry more than one. 2 people could watch in 2 directions simultaneously. And if something went wrong, 2 people had a better chance of at least one getting back to warn the others. Tomas agreed. We set the run for the following morning. I barely slept that night. I lay on the exam table in room 4, staring at the ceiling tiles in the dark, and rehearsed every step of the route in my mind. Out the back door, across our small parking lot, through the gap in the fence that separated our property from the adjacent lot, along the back side of the next building, an accountant's office that had been closed since day 1, to the side street. Then a direct approach to the convenience store from the rear. We would avoid the main road entirely. At 5:15 in the morning, on what I believe was day 5, Tomas and I went out. I carried a backpack that we'd found in the lost and found bin, and Tomas carried a large canvas bag that had been used to transport medical samples. We each had a weapon of sorts. I had a heavy metal paper towel dispenser that I'd removed from the bathroom wall, and Tomas had a length of metal pipe that he'd taken from a shelving unit in the storage closet. These were not effective weapons in any real sense. They were comfort objects. If we encountered an infected person at close range, a paper towel dispenser was not going to save me. The plan was to not encounter anyone at all. The morning air was the first thing that struck me. I had been inside for almost 5 full days, and I had forgotten what outside felt like. It was cool, just before sunrise, with that thin blue light that makes everything look slightly unreal. The second thing that struck me was the smell. There was something in the air, faint but unmistakable once you noticed it. A sweetness that wasn't sweet, a richness that wasn't pleasant. The first distant edge of decomposition. Not overwhelming, not yet, but present, like a rumor. We moved quickly and quietly. Every step sounded enormous to me. The crunch of gravel, the scuff of a shoe on asphalt. Each sound seemed to carry for hundreds of yards in the still morning air. Tomas moved better than I did. He placed his feet deliberately, kept his profile low, and communicated with hand gestures. I tried to follow his lead. The convenience store was intact, but had already been partially looted. The front window was cracked but not shattered. The door was ajar, as Tomas had observed. We entered through the rear, through a service door that was unlocked. Inside, the shelves were disordered but not empty. Someone had taken the obvious things, chips, candy, beer, and left behind the things that actually mattered for survival. We took every bottle of water we could find, 18 total in various sizes. We took canned food, beans, tuna, soup, vegetables, fruit. We took the remaining packages of crackers, a bag of rice, 2 jars of peanut butter, and a box of protein bars. We took matches, a lighter, a roll of duct tape, 2 flashlights with batteries, and a small first aid kit that was comically redundant given where we lived, but I took it anyway. We filled our bags to the point of strain and made the return trip in under 40 minutes total. Nobody had followed us. Nothing had noticed us. We got back inside the clinic, locked the back door, and sat on the floor of the hallway, breathing hard, surrounded by supplies. Grace took inventory immediately. Dr. Patel checked us both for any scratches, bites, or signs of exposure. A protocol we established on the spot and maintained for any subsequent contact with the outside. Tomas and I were clean. The supplies bought us time. Not a lot. Maybe another week of careful rationing. But time is the only currency that matters in a survival situation. Every day you stay alive is another day that rescue might come, that the situation might change, that some variable you can't predict might break in your favor. We settled into a routine. Routines are underrated in crisis situations. People talk about adaptability and quick thinking, and those matter, but what keeps you sane over the course of days and weeks is structure. We woke at first light. We ate a small, measured breakfast. We checked the windows, carefully, from the side, never standing in front of them. We listened to the radio for 10 minutes. We attended to whatever tasks needed doing. We ate a second meal in the late afternoon. We secured the building for the night. We slept, or tried to. Tomas and I alternated night watch, 4 hours each. Dr. Patel offered to join the rotation, but I told her she was too valuable in her primary role to risk sleep deprivation. This was true, but it was also true that I preferred to control the watch rotation tightly. The night watch wasn't just about security. It was about awareness. The person on watch was the person who would make the first decision if something happened. and I wanted that person to be either me or Tomas. Grace took on the role of supply manager with a thoroughness that bordered on the obsessive, and I mean that as a compliment. She measured water in milliliters. She tracked calories. She calculated consumption rates and projected supply depletion dates with a precision that was both reassuring and sobering. On day 7, she told me, privately, that at current rationing levels we had food for approximately 9 more days and water for 6. The water was always the limiting factor. You can stretch food. You can reduce portions, skip meals, tolerate hunger. Dehydration kills you on a much shorter and less negotiable timeline. Patricia was the member of our group who concerned me most, not because she was difficult, but because she was the most vulnerable. She was 71 years old, had moderate hypertension that was controlled with medication, which we had in supply, fortunately, and mild osteoarthritis that made her movements slow and painful. She couldn't run. She couldn't climb. In any scenario that required rapid evacuation, she would be the slowest, and we all knew it, including her. She never said it aloud, but I caught her looking at the rest of us sometimes with an expression that I interpreted as a quiet, preemptive apology, as if she was sorry in advance for the burden she might become. I made a point of including her in every discussion, every decision, not because she had particular expertise, but because exclusion breeds despair, and despair in a confined space is as dangerous as any external threat. Patricia had been a school teacher for 35 years. She was organized, patient, and observant. I asked her to maintain a log, a written record of each day, what we ate, what we observed outside, any decisions we made, and why. She took to this immediately, writing in a neat, small hand in a notebook she'd found in Dr. Patel's office. That log became one of the most valuable things we produced, not for any practical survival purpose, but because it gave Patricia a function, a role, a reason to pay attention to each day, rather than simply enduring it. The human dynamics inside the clinic were, in many ways, more complex and more dangerous than the threat outside. Not because anyone was malicious or selfish. Everyone contributed, everyone cooperated. But because confinement, stress, fear, and uncertainty create friction even among well-intentioned people. Small irritations became disproportionately significant. The way someone chewed, the sound of someone shifting on a paper-covered exam table at 2 in the morning, a disagreement about whether to open a window another inch. These things, which would have been meaningless in normal life, acquired weight in our compressed little world. The first serious conflict came on day 8. It was between Grace and Tomas, and it was about the second supply run. We were approaching the point where another run would become necessary, and the question of who would go and where they would go was fraught. The convenience store had been our obvious first target, but we'd taken nearly everything useful from it. The next closest options were farther away. A small grocery store about a quarter-mile down the main road, or a residential area behind the clinic, where we might find supplies in abandoned homes. Each option carried significantly more risk than the first run had. Grace argued that the grocery store was the better target, despite the greater distance, because it would potentially yield a larger haul, enough to sustain us for weeks rather than days. Tomas argued for the residential area, which was closer and offered more concealment, but would likely yield smaller, less predictable quantities. The disagreement was civil at first, but escalated into something sharper when Grace implied that Tomas was being overly cautious, and Tomas responded that Grace was being reckless with other people's safety since she wasn't the one going outside. I let the argument play out for a few minutes before intervening. Not because I wanted them to fight, but because I wanted everyone to hear both perspectives fully. Then I said that we would do neither, at least not yet. We would first do a more careful reconnaissance, watching from the windows at different times of day, noting the movement patterns of infected individuals in both directions, and making a decision based on observed data rather than assumption. Both of them accepted this, though neither was entirely happy. The reconnaissance took 2 days. What we observed was troubling. The infected were becoming more numerous. During the first few days, we had seen them infrequently, 1 or 2 at a time, usually at a distance, often standing motionless or moving in slow, directionless patterns. By day 9 and 10, we were seeing groups, not organized groups. There was nothing coordinated about their behavior, but clusters of 4 or 5, sometimes more, moving along the road or through the parking lots of nearby businesses. Their movement wasn't purposeful in any way I could discern. They seemed to drift towards sound. On the evening of day 9, a car alarm went off somewhere to the east, and within 20 minutes we watched 7 infected individuals move in that direction, drawn like moths toward the noise. This confirmed what we had suspected. Sound was their primary attractor. This observation had immediate implications for our supply run. The main road, even in the early morning, was now too exposed. Too much open ground, too many sight lines, too high a probability of being seen or heard. The residential area behind the clinic remained viable. It offered fences, hedges, narrow passages between houses, places to hide if needed. But it also offered uncertainty. We didn't know what was inside those houses. An infected individual in an enclosed space was far more dangerous than one in the open, because you couldn't see it coming, and you had fewer options for retreat. On the morning of day 11, Tomas and I went out again. This time, we went into the residential area. We targeted 3 houses that we had been watching from the clinic windows and that appeared unoccupied. No lights, no movement, no sounds. We approached the first one from the back, through a wooden gate that Tomas was able to force open quietly. The back door was locked. We broke a small window pane in the laundry room, reached in, and unlocked the door. The sound of the glass breaking, a small, sharp crack, nearly stopped my heart. We both froze, crouched against the side of the house, listening. Nothing came. No movement. No response. After 2 full minutes of stillness, we entered. The house was empty. Not abandoned in a rush, it looked like the occupants had packed deliberately and left. Closets were half empty. A suitcase was missing from a set in the bedroom. The pantry, however, had been left mostly intact. Canned goods, dry pasta, rice, cooking oil, coffee, a half-full container of powdered milk, salt, sugar. The refrigerator was full of spoiled food. The power had been out here too. But the freezer still held some items that had thawed but not yet gone bad. We took what was still usable. In the bathroom, we found a full bottle of ibuprofen, a course of amoxicillin that had been prescribed but apparently not finished. Dr. Patel would decide whether those were still usable. And several bottles of toiletry items. Under the kitchen sink, we found 4 gallons of distilled water, the kind used for steam irons and humidifiers. It was water. Drinkable, life-saving water. The second house was similarly productive. The third house we skipped. When we approached it, Tomas held up his hand and pointed. Through the back window, barely visible in the dim interior, something was moving. A shape, slow and irregular, pacing in what appeared to be a kitchen. We backed away without a sound and returned to the clinic with our haul. That second run changed our supply situation fundamentally. Grace ran the numbers and told us we now had food for approximately 3 weeks and water for about 12 days. Possibly longer if we could find additional water sources or if it rained and we could collect runoff. 12 days of water felt like an enormous luxury. I remember the specific feeling of relief when she said it, a loosening in my chest that I hadn't realized had been tightening for days. But the situation outside continued to deteriorate. On day 12, we saw our first large group of infected, at least 15, moving together along the main road in a loose, shambling mass. They moved past the clinic without pausing, apparently attracted to something farther down the road. Watching them from the narrow window of exam room 3, I was able to observe them more closely than I had before. Their movements were degraded, jerky, uncoordinated, as if the connection between their brains and their muscles had been damaged but not severed. Some of them had visible injuries. One was missing most of an arm. Another had what appeared to be a large wound on its torso, dark and wet. None of them wore expressions. That was the detail that unsettled me most. Their faces were slack, empty, operating on some engine that had nothing to do with thought or emotion. They were bodies running on something that wasn't quite life. Patricia stopped coming to the windows after that. She stayed in exam room 5, writing in her log, sleeping, or sitting quietly. Dr. Patel checked on her regularly. Patricia's blood pressure was elevated but manageable, and her spirits, while subdued, were not what I would call collapsed. She was enduring. That's a word I came to respect enormously during those weeks. Endurance isn't glamorous. It's not exciting. It's the simple, grinding act of continuing to exist through conditions that make existence feel pointless. Patricia endured better than any of us. Day 13 brought the midpoint event, the thing that changed the internal calculus of our group. At around 2 in the afternoon, someone knocked on the back door of the clinic. The sound was so unexpected, so jarringly human, that for a moment none of us moved. Then the knock came again. 3 deliberate raps, spaced evenly. Not the random banging of an infected individual. This was purposeful. This was a person. Tomas and I approached the back door together. The door was solid, no window, no peephole. I pressed my ear against it and said quietly, "Who's there?" A voice answered, male, young, strained. "Please, I need help. I'm not sick. Please." We had discussed this scenario. We had even agreed on a protocol. We would assess any person seeking entry for signs of infection before admitting them, and any admission required agreement from at least 3 of the 5 of us. But protocols created in the abstract feel different when applied to a voice on the other side of a door. I looked at Tomas. He shook his head, not emphatically, but firmly. I looked at Dr. Patel, who had come up behind us. She said, "Ask him if he's been bitten or scratched." I asked. The voice said no. He said his name was Jay, that he'd been hiding in a car for 2 days, that he was out of water and hadn't eaten. He said he'd seen our building and thought it might be occupied because he noticed the windows were sealed. We brought it to the group. Grace said yes, let him in. Tomas said no. Patricia said she would go along with whatever the group decided. Dr. Patel said she wanted to assess him first. I was the tiebreaker, and I sat with the decision for what felt like a long time, but was probably about 2 minutes. I said, "Open the door." My reasoning was this. We were 5 people in a building designed for many more. Our supplies, while finite, had just been significantly replenished. Turning away a person in genuine need would cost us something that supplies couldn't replace. It would cost us our sense of ourselves as people who were worth surviving. I know how that sounds. I know it's not purely logical. But survival without some framework of decency isn't survival. It's just postponed death with extra steps. We opened the door. Jay was early 20s, thin, dark-haired, visibly dehydrated, trembling. Dr. Patel examined him immediately. No bites, no scratches, no fever, no signs of infection. He drank water in small, careful sips. Grace controlled the amount, and ate a few crackers. Then he sat on the floor of the hallway and told us what he'd seen. Jay had been working at a restaurant about 3 miles away when the outbreak hit. He described chaos. Infected individuals pouring into the building, people running, screaming, fighting. He had escaped through a kitchen window and spent the next several days moving on foot, hiding in cars, sheds, and dumpsters. He had seen things that he described in flat, detached language. People being attacked, people turning, bodies in the streets. He said the town center was essentially gone. Most buildings were either overrun or burned. He said he hadn't seen any organized rescue, any military presence, any sign of functioning authority. He said that as far as he could tell, everyone who hadn't gotten out in the first 2 days was either dead, infected, or hiding. His account confirmed what we had been fearing but hadn't wanted to confirm. We were on our own for the foreseeable future. Whatever response was happening, it wasn't happening here. Not yet. Our survival depended entirely on our own decisions. Jay integrated into the group more smoothly than I expected. He was young, but not foolish. He listened more than he spoke. He deferred to the established routines and offered to take on any task we needed. I put him on the night watch rotation, which gave Tomas and me each a longer rest period. A gift so valuable that I was almost embarrassed by how much it improved my cognitive function. Sleep deprivation had been degrading my thinking in ways I hadn't fully appreciated until I started sleeping 5 hours instead of 3. Day 14 through day 17 formed a stretch that I think of as the long middle. Nothing dramatic happened. We rationed. We watched. We listened to the radio twice a day and heard the same automated message, unchanged, looping endlessly. We talked sometimes. Grace and Patricia played a game where they tried to name every U.S. state capital from memory. Dr. Patel taught Tomas and Jay basic suturing technique on a piece of foam from a packing crate, reasoning that medical skills distributed across more people increased the group's resilience. I read a patient education pamphlet about diabetes management 17 times because it was the only printed material I hadn't already read. The boredom was remarkable. I hadn't anticipated that. In the early days, adrenaline and urgency had kept my mind sharply focused. But by the second week, with routines established and immediate threats managed, the mind began to wander into dangerous territory. Not dangerous in the sense of recklessness, but dangerous in the sense of despair. You begin to think about the future in terms that feel increasingly theoretical. Will I ever see my apartment again? Will the world go back? Is there a world to go back to? These thoughts are useless in a practical sense, but they're persistent, and if you let them gain momentum, they can erode your will to maintain the discipline that keeps you alive. I dealt with this by staying busy. I reorganized the supply closet. I cleaned. I made detailed drawings of the surrounding area based on what we could see from the windows, noting the positions of vehicles, debris, and any changes we observed. I worked with Tomas on improving our physical security. We reinforced the front barricade with additional furniture and used strips of fabric to muffle the filing cabinet drawers so they wouldn't rattle if something impacted the windows. We identified secondary exit routes in case the front and back doors were both compromised. The best option was a window in exam room 7 that faced the back of the property and opened onto a narrow strip of grass between our building and a concrete retaining wall. It wasn't a good exit. You'd have to climb through a window that was about 4 feet off the ground on the inside and drop down into a space barely wide enough to move through. But it was an exit, and having it identified and prepared gave us one more option in a worst-case scenario. Tomas loosened the window's locking mechanism so it could be opened quickly and quietly, and we placed a step stool beneath it. The weather cooperated with us once, and it mattered enormously. On the night of day 15, it rained. Not a heavy storm, a steady, soaking rain that lasted most of the night. We had been preparing for this possibility since day 6, when I had positioned every open container we could spare along the edges of the flat roof's drainage points, accessible from the back door. The roof collected water and funneled it to 2 downspouts at the rear of the building. When the rain started, I went outside in the dark, the first and only time I went out at night, and positioned our containers beneath the downspouts. I stood in the rain for approximately 10 minutes, adjusting the placement, and then went back inside and locked the door. By morning, we had collected roughly 12 gallons of rainwater. It wasn't clean. It had washed across a commercial roof surface and carried traces of dirt, bird droppings, and whatever else had accumulated up there. But we filtered it through layers of cotton gauze from our medical supplies, and then treated it with a small amount of bleach that Grace had found under the clinic's utility sink. Dr. Patel confirmed that the concentration was within safe limits for disinfection. That rainwater extended our supply timeline by days. I remember Grace recalculating and announcing, with a rare smile, that we now had water for approximately 18 days at current consumption levels. 18 days. It felt like wealth. But day 16 took something from us that supplies couldn't replace. Dr. Patel had been quieter than usual for a couple of days. I had noticed it, but attributed it to the general weight of the situation. She was carrying an enormous psychological burden. She was our only physician, the person everyone looked to when anything medical arose, and the person who felt most acutely the gap between what she could do in this environment and what she could do in a functioning hospital. She had confided in me on day 10 that her greatest fear wasn't the infected outside. It was someone inside, developing a medical emergency that she couldn't treat with what we had. An appendicitis, a heart attack, a severe allergic reaction after the epinephrine was used, a complicated infection that didn't respond to the limited antibiotics in our supply. On the afternoon of day 16, she asked me to step into her office. She closed the door, which was unusual. We had adopted an open-door culture as a general practice, both for airflow and for the psychological comfort of not feeling isolated. She sat behind her desk, and I sat in the patient chair across from her. And for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she told me she was leaving. Not immediately, the next morning. She had been thinking about it for days, she said, and she had made her decision. Her husband and children were at their home, approximately 11 miles away. She had no way of knowing if they were still safe. The lack of communication had been eating at her in ways she hadn't shown, and she had reached the point where remaining at the clinic was no longer tenable for her, psychologically. She needed to try to reach them. I didn't argue with her immediately. I sat with it. I understood her reasoning, even as I recognized that her departure would be devastating to our group. She was our medical expertise. She was a stabilizing presence. She was someone the others trusted implicitly. Losing her would be a material blow to our survival capability. But I also understood that she was a mother with 2 children, and that no amount of logical argument about group survival calculus was going to override that pull. I had seen it in her face every day since the phones went dead. A tension that wasn't about the clinic or the infected or the supplies. It was about the silence from home, and what that silence might mean. I asked her practical questions. How did she plan to travel? On foot, she said. The roads were too unpredictable for a vehicle, and she didn't have access to one anyway. What route? She had mapped it from our window observations and from her knowledge of the area. She would avoid main roads, cut through residential areas, and along a creek bed that ran roughly in the right direction. She estimated it would take 4 to 6 hours if she moved carefully. I told her the risks were enormous. She said she knew. I told her the group needed her. She said she knew that too, and that she was sorry. I told her I wouldn't try to stop her, but I asked her to do two things. Brief Grace thoroughly on emergency medical procedures before she left, and leave at first light when the infected were least active. She agreed to both. That evening, Dr. Patel spent 3 hours with Grace, going over everything she could think of. Wound care, infection signs, medication dosages, what to do in case of allergic reaction, shock, dehydration, and a dozen other scenarios. She wrote it all down in a condensed manual, filling 8 pages of notebook paper in her precise handwriting. She prepared a small medical kit from our supplies, just the essentials, and packed it in a shoulder bag along with 2 bottles of water, a can of tuna, and a handful of protein bars. She told the group that evening. Patricia cried, quietly, and then composed herself and wished Dr. Patel well. Grace hugged her for a long time without speaking. Tomas shook her hand and said something to her in a low voice that I didn't hear. Jay stood a little apart, uncertain of his place in the moment, and said simply, "Good luck, Doc." I walked her to the back door the next morning at 5:20 in the gray pre-dawn light. She looked at me and said, "Keep them alive." I said I would try. She nodded, and then she went through the door, and I locked it behind her. And that was the last time I saw Dr. Annalise Patel. Her absence was a wound. There's no other way to describe it. It wasn't just the loss of her medical knowledge or her calm authority. It was the loss of a certain kind of hope that she carried without seeming to. She believed, or at least she behaved as if she believed, that the situation was temporary, that order would return, that the right decisions made consistently would lead to survival and eventually to normalcy. Without her, that belief became harder to sustain. Not impossible, but harder. I took on more of the leadership role by default, which was uncomfortable for me. I'm not a natural leader. I'm an organizer. I see systems, logistics, efficiencies. I can tell you that we need to reduce water consumption by 8% to make it to day 25. But I'm not the person who makes you feel like day 25 is worth reaching. Grace stepped into that role somewhat. She had a warmth that I lacked, a way of checking in with people that didn't feel clinical or obligatory. Between the two of us, we covered the functional and the emotional, and it was enough to keep the group cohesive. Day 17 was quiet. Day 18 was quiet. The quiet itself became a kind of environment, as tangible as the heat or the smell. The world outside had gone nearly silent. We rarely saw infected individuals near the clinic anymore. They seemed to have drifted toward the town center, drawn by whatever residual noise or activity remained there. The road in front of us was empty for hours at a time. Once, a dog walked past. A large mutt, thin and dirty, moving with the cautious purposefulness of an animal that had learned to survive on its own. Patricia saw it from the window and said, softly, "At least the dogs are still okay." I didn't tell her that we had also heard, several nights earlier, sounds that suggested not all the dogs were okay. On day 18, we made a third supply run. This time, it was Tomas and Jay. I stayed behind, not out of cowardice, but because I had developed a persistent pain in my left knee from sleeping on exam tables and sitting on hard floors, and I didn't trust myself to move quickly enough if the situation demanded it. This bothered me more than I wanted to admit. The knee wasn't a serious injury, probably a mild sprain or tendinitis from the awkward sleeping positions, but in our context, any reduction in physical capability felt like a reduction in survival probability. Dr. Patel would have looked at it, told me to rest it, maybe wrapped it. Without her, I did my best impression of what she would have done. I wrapped it with an elastic bandage, took ibuprofen, and tried to stay off it when possible. Tomas and Jay were gone for just over an hour. They went deeper into the residential area than we had before, hitting 2 more houses and returning with a solid haul. More canned food, several jugs of water they found in a garage, a battery-powered lantern, a heavy blanket, a box of matches, and, unexpectedly, a small hand-crank radio that one of the homeowners had apparently kept as an emergency preparedness item. This was a significant find. Our battery-powered radio was running low, and we had been reducing our listening time to conserve power. The hand-crank radio freed us from that constraint. We could listen as long as someone was willing to turn the crank. That evening, we spent an hour scanning frequencies. For the first time, we picked up a live broadcast. Not the automated emergency loop, but an actual human voice. It was faint, scratchy, fading in and out, but unmistakable. A man's voice, speaking calmly, identifying himself as a volunteer operator on a ham radio frequency. He gave a brief situation report. The military had established a secure perimeter around the state capital, approximately 60 miles to the northeast. Evacuation points were being set up along major highways, but travel was extremely dangerous. He advised anyone listening to remain sheltered if they had supplies, and to avoid movement at night under all circumstances. He said the infection appeared to be slowing in some areas, not reversing, not curing, but the rate of new infections was declining, possibly because there were fewer uninfected people left in the affected zones. He repeated the information about the military perimeter and the evacuation points twice, then said he would broadcast again the following evening at the same time. We listened to that broadcast in the dark, gathered around the small radio in the back hallway, and no one spoke for several minutes after it ended. It was the first human voice from outside our walls that we had heard in nearly 2 weeks. The information itself was a mix of hope and despair. A secure perimeter existed, but it was 60 miles away through hostile territory. The infection was slowing, but only because the pool of victims was running out. Still, it was information, context, a frame for our situation. After days of operating in a vacuum, even grim context felt like relief. I made the decision that night that we would not attempt to reach the evacuation points. 60 miles was an impossible distance on foot through territory that was teeming with infected. We had no vehicle, no weapons beyond improvised clubs, and our group included a 71-year-old woman with limited mobility. The math didn't work. If we left the clinic, we would almost certainly not all make it. If we stayed, we had shelter, supplies for approximately 2 more weeks, and the possibility that rescue would extend toward us as the military perimeter expanded. It was a gamble either way. I chose the gamble that required fewer things to go right. Tomas disagreed. Not forcefully. He was never forceful in his disagreements, but he made his case. He felt that staying indefinitely was a losing proposition. Supplies would eventually run out. The building offered no long-term sustainability, no way to grow food, collect reliable water, or defend against a determined assault. He proposed that he and Jay could make the journey as scouts, reaching the perimeter and potentially returning with help. He was honest about the risks, but argued that the potential payoff, actual rescue, justified them. I respected his reasoning, but I asked him a question that I think changed his mind, or at least made him reconsider. I asked him what we would do if he and Jay left and didn't come back. Not what would happen to them. What would happen to Grace, Patricia, and me. 3 people, one of them elderly, with no one capable of making supply runs or providing security. His jaw tightened when I said that, and I could see him recalculating. He didn't bring it up again. Days 19 through 22 were the hardest stretch, not because of any single event, but because of the accumulated weight of everything. The heat was relentless. The building smelled of sweat, stale food, and the chemical odor of the medical supplies. We were all losing weight. Our caloric intake was well below maintenance levels, and it was beginning to show. Grace's face had thinned noticeably. Tomas, who had been solidly built, was becoming angular. Patricia moved even more slowly, and there were moments when I saw her wince in pain and try to hide it. My own body felt fragile in a way I'd never experienced. A persistent low-grade fatigue that sleep didn't fully resolve. A dizziness when I stood up too quickly. A weakness in my hands that made gripping things difficult. The psychological toll was equally severe. Boredom had deepened into something more corrosive, a kind of existential numbness that made it difficult to care about the routines that were keeping us alive. I caught myself one afternoon standing in front of our water supply, staring at it, thinking about how easy it would be to just drink my fill for once, to feel sated, to not measure every sip. I didn't do it, but the fact that I thought about it frightened me, because it meant my discipline was eroding, and discipline was the only thing between us and disaster. I dealt with this by creating new tasks, however small. I asked Jay to map every room of the clinic in detail, noting dimensions, furniture placement, and potential hazards. I asked Grace to develop a recipe system for our canned goods that would maximize variety within our limited ingredients. I asked Patricia to continue her log, but also to write down anything she could remember about the area, neighboring businesses, residential layouts, water features, anything that might be useful for future supply runs or evacuation planning. I gave Tomas the project of designing a signaling system that we could deploy on the roof if we ever spotted a rescue aircraft or convoy, something visible from the air. He used medical tape and exam table paper to create a large cross symbol that could be unfurled on the flat roof in under a minute. These tasks were partially practical and partially therapeutic. Keeping the mind engaged in constructive activity is, I believe, as important as keeping the body fed and hydrated. Maybe more important. A person who is given up mentally will make the kind of careless, impulsive decision that gets them killed, regardless of how many cans of beans they have in reserve. On day 20, something happened that tested us in a different way. We heard screaming outside, close, maybe 100 yards away, from the direction of the residential area. It was a woman's voice, high-pitched, desperate, ragged with terror. It went on, rising and falling, punctuated by sounds that I can only describe as impacts. Wet, heavy sounds. Then the screaming thinned, stuttered, and stopped. We sat in the hallway and listened to the silence that followed. No one moved. No one spoke. Grace was gripping her own hands so tightly that her knuckles were white. Jay had his eyes closed. Tomas was perfectly still, his face set in an expression that I had come to recognize as his way of containing emotion. A deliberate blankness that kept everything locked inside. Patricia was the first to speak. She said, very quietly, "We couldn't have helped her." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, delivered in the tone of someone who needed to say it aloud in order to believe it. She was right. We couldn't have helped. By the time we heard the screaming, it was already too late. Even if it hadn't been, rushing outside toward the sound would have meant exposing ourselves to unknown numbers of infected in an open area with no defensible position. The logical conclusion was clear. But logic doesn't prevent the sound from replaying in your memory at 3 a.m, and it doesn't stop you from wondering whether the woman might have survived if someone, anyone, had intervened. That night, I sat with Grace during her portion of a watch shift that she had asked to take over from me because my knee was bothering me, and she could see I was exhausted. We sat in the dark, backs against the wall of the corridor, speaking in voices barely above a whisper. She told me she had been a hospice nurse before joining the clinic. She said she was familiar with death, not comfortable with it, but familiar. What she wasn't familiar with was the inability to help. In hospice, she said, you couldn't save people, but you could ease their passage. You could hold their hand. You could make sure they weren't in pain. Here, she couldn't even do that. She could only listen to someone die and then sit in the silence afterward. I didn't have a good answer for that. I told her that what she was doing inside the clinic, managing our supplies, watching over Patricia, maintaining the structures and routines that kept us functional, was its own form of care. It wasn't the kind she was trained for, but it was the kind that was needed. She considered this and then said, I know, but it doesn't feel like enough. I told her I understood, because I did. Day 21 brought a development that shifted the trajectory of our situation. During the morning radio scan, we picked up the ham operator again. His report was markedly different from the one we'd heard days earlier. The military perimeter, he said, was expanding. Rescue convoys were moving outward from the secure zones along cleared routes. He listed several towns that had been reached and secured in the previous 48 hours. Our town was not among them, but 2 of the towns he named were within 30 miles of us. He said the pace of expansion was accelerating as the number of active infected in the outer zones continued to decline. He estimated and emphasized that this was only an estimate, that outlying areas like ours might be reached within 1 to 2 weeks. 1 to 2 weeks. That was the first concrete timeline we had been given. Not a guarantee, an estimate from a volunteer radio operator whose information might be incomplete or outdated. But it was something to measure against our supplies. Grace ran the numbers immediately. At current rationing, we had food for approximately 10 to 12 more days and water for 8, possibly 10 if we had another rain event. It was tight. It was very tight, but it was feasible. For the first time since the doors were locked, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that we might actually be rescued. Not saved by our own ingenuity or endurance, but reached by an external force that was systematically working its way toward us. I had built our entire strategy around the assumption that we were alone and needed to be self-sufficient indefinitely. The idea that someone was coming, that all we had to do was hold on, was disorienting in its simplicity. I shared the information with the group. The reaction was complex. Hope is a dangerous thing in a survival situation, because if it doesn't materialize, the crash is devastating. I saw it on their faces, the desire to believe, held in check by the fear of disappointment. Tomas was characteristically measured. Good news if it's accurate. We plan as if it's not. Grace allowed herself a small, cautious optimism. 10 days. We can do 10 days. Jay just nodded, repeatedly, as if convincing himself. Patricia wrote it in her log, noting the date and the specifics, and then added a line that I saw later when she showed me the entry. Perhaps. We continued as before, but with a subtle shift in energy. The routines felt less like endurance and more like countdown. Grace managed our supplies with even greater precision, stretching every meal, shaving margins, finding ways to make the arithmetic work. Tomas maintained the security protocols without relaxation. He reminded us, rightly, that hope didn't change the number of infected outside. I continued the watch rotation, the window checks, the radio scans. On day 22, we lost something I hadn't anticipated losing. The plumbing backed up. Without the municipal water system operating, and with no power to run any pumps, the building's sewage system had been functioning on gravity alone. And now something, a blockage, a collapse in the line, something underground that we couldn't diagnose or fix, caused it to fail. The toilet stopped flushing. Within hours, the smell became a problem. Within a day, it became a genuine health risk. We improvised. Tomas and Jay dug a shallow latrine outside the back door, behind the dumpster enclosure, shielded from view on 3 sides. Using it required going outside, which was a risk, but a managed one. We established a protocol where one person used the latrine while another stood at the back door watching. We used it only during early morning and late evening, when infected activity was lowest. We sealed the clinic bathrooms with duct tape and towels to contain the odor. It was degrading, uncomfortable, and a reminder that survival is not dignified. It is functional or it is not. And dignity is a luxury that belongs to stable circumstances. Day 23. Day 24. The radio operator continued his broadcasts. The perimeter was still expanding. 2 more towns within our region had been reached. The closest secured area was now approximately 15 miles away. Each broadcast tightened the timeline. Each broadcast made the gap between our supplies and rescue a little less terrifying. But on the evening of day 24, the radio went silent. We cranked and scanned and heard nothing. Static across every frequency. We tried again the next morning. Nothing. Tomas speculated that the operator's equipment had failed, or that he had relocated, or that something had happened to him. We had no way of knowing. The silence was total again, and after having had information, after having had hope with a timeline, losing it felt worse than never having had it. Day 25 was the day I made the decision that I consider the most difficult of the entire experience. Our water supply was critically low. Grace estimated 2 days remaining, maybe 3 if we cut consumption to levels that would begin to cause cognitive impairment. Food was less critical. We had perhaps 5 days' worth, but without water, food was irrelevant. We needed another supply run, but the residential houses closest to us had been cleared out in our previous trips. Going farther meant more time outside, more exposure, more risk. I decided that Tomas, Jay, and I would all go. 3 people, covering more ground, able to carry more, able to provide better security for each other. Grace would stay with Patricia. If we weren't back in 2 hours, Grace was to seal the building and wait. If we weren't back by evening, she was to assume we weren't coming back and make her own decisions accordingly. We left at 5 in the morning. The neighborhood was still, the light just beginning to turn from gray to gold. We moved in a loose formation. Tomas on point, me in the middle, Jay at the rear, and communicated with hand signals that we had practiced inside the clinic. We went 6 houses deep into the residential area, farther than we had ever gone. The first 3 houses had been looted by others before us. Doors broken, contents scattered, little of value remaining. The 4th house yielded some canned goods and a few bottles of soda, which we took for the liquid content. The 5th house had a rain barrel in the backyard, half full. We stared at it for a moment as if it were made of gold. We filled every container we had. The 6th house is where things went wrong. Jay was checking the kitchen while Tomas covered the front of the house, and I filled water containers from the rain barrel. I heard a crash from inside, the sound of something heavy falling, followed by a shout from Jay, cut short. I dropped the containers and moved toward the back door. Tomas was already moving from his position. We converged on the kitchen from 2 directions and found Jay on the floor, holding his ankle, his face twisted in pain. He had stepped on a section of floor weakened by water damage, a slow leak from a dishwasher it looked like, and his foot had gone through, twisting his ankle badly. There was no infected person involved. It was just a rotting floor in an abandoned house. The mundane danger that you forget about when you're focused on the extraordinary one. Getting Jay back to the clinic was agonizing. He couldn't put weight on the ankle, and though he tried to muffle his pain, he was making sounds. Sounds attracted attention. Tomas and I half carried him between us, moving as fast as we could while maintaining some semblance of quiet. The trip back, which should have taken 10 minutes, took nearly 30. Every second felt like an exposure we couldn't afford. We made it. No infected appeared, but Jay's ankle was badly sprained, possibly fractured. Without imaging, we couldn't tell. Grace examined it using the notes Dr. Patel had left, splinted it with materials from the exam rooms, and administered ibuprofen for the pain and swelling. Jay was mobile, barely, with an improvised crutch made from a mop handle, but he was no longer capable of supply runs or any task requiring quick movement. Our operational capacity had just been reduced by a third. The water from the rain barrel, combined with what we'd gathered from the houses, bought us approximately 5 more days. 5 days. The military perimeter had been 15 miles away as of the last broadcast we received, and it had been closing at a rate of several miles per day. If that rate held, a significant if, rescue could potentially reach us within that window. I began to think about signaling. Tomas's rooftop cross was ready, but only useful if someone was looking. I wanted something more active. We had matches and lighters. The clinic's parking lot was open asphalt, visible from the road, and more importantly, from the air. If we could build a fire, controlled, visible, producing smoke, it might attract attention from a rescue convoy or aerial survey. The risk was that it might also attract infected. Fire meant light at night and smoke during the day, both of which were the opposite of the silence and invisibility strategy that had kept us alive. I waited for a full day before deciding. On day 27, we would prepare a signal fire in the parking lot, ready to ignite at the first sign of organized rescue activity. Not a permanent fire, a prepared one that we could light quickly and then retreat inside. It was a compromise between reaching out and staying hidden. Day 26 passed. Day 27 arrived. We prepared the fire. Tomas gathered the materials and arranged them in the parking lot in the early morning, working quickly, using exam table paper, wooden chair legs, and cardboard from supply boxes. We soaked a portion of the material in hand sanitizer, which was alcohol-based and would ignite readily. Then we retreated inside and waited. At approximately 2 in the afternoon, we heard it. A sound so foreign to our world that it took a moment to identify. The rhythmic thudding of a helicopter. Distant at first, then closer. Tomas and I moved to the windows, violating our own protocol, standing directly in front of the glass for the first time, and scanned the sky. There, to the northeast. A military helicopter, moving slowly, flying a pattern that looked like a search grid. I ran to the back door, unlocked it, and sprinted, as much as my knee would allow, to the signal fire. Tomas was behind me with the lighter. He ignited it on the first try. The hand sanitizer caught immediately, and within seconds, the fire was producing a column of white-gray smoke that climbed straight up in the still afternoon air. We went back inside and watched from the windows. The helicopter continued its pattern. It was maybe a mile away. The smoke rose. I felt my heart beating in a way I hadn't been conscious of in weeks. Not from fear, but from something closer to desperate, clinging hope. The helicopter turned. It moved toward us. It passed over the clinic at about 500 feet, close enough that we could see the markings. Military. It circled once, then twice, and then banked and continued on its route. I felt something collapse inside me. It hadn't stopped. It had seen us. It must have seen the smoke, but it hadn't stopped. Tomas, standing beside me, said, "They saw us. They'll mark the position. They'll come back." I wanted to believe him. I wasn't sure I did. But he was right. On the morning of day 28, 19 days after I had locked the front door of the Millbrook Family Medical Clinic, a military convoy appeared on the road. 2 armored vehicles and a truck, moving slowly, accompanied by soldiers on foot clearing the area as they advanced. They stopped in front of the clinic. A voice on a loudspeaker instructed any survivors inside to make themselves known. I walked to the front door. I moved the stacked chairs aside. I moved the filing cabinets. I unlocked the deadbolt. And I opened the door for the first time in nearly 3 weeks. The sunlight was blinding. The air smelled wrong, too open, too vast, carrying that same undercurrent of decay, but mixed now with diesel exhaust and something else that might have been hope. A soldier approached, weapon lowered, and asked how many we were. I said 5. He asked if anyone was injured. I said 1 sprained ankle, 1 elderly woman with hypertension, and various degrees of dehydration and malnutrition. He asked if anyone had been bitten. I said no. He spoke into a radio, and then more soldiers approached, and a medic, and things began happening around me at a pace that felt impossibly fast, after weeks of deliberate slowness. They loaded us into the truck. Grace went first, helping Patricia up the ramp. Tomas followed, then Jay, leaning on his crutch. I was last. Before I stepped up, I turned and looked back at the clinic. The small, unremarkable building with its flat roof and narrow windows, and its sign that still said, "Closed." It had kept us alive. Not because it was strong or fortified or special, but because it was enclosed, and we had decided to stay inside it. And we had made that decision work through patience, discipline, and a relentless attention to the small things that add up to survival. I climbed into the truck and sat down on the metal bench next to Patricia. She had her notebook in her lap. She had carried it out with her, the complete log of our 19 days. She looked at me and said, "We made it." I said yes. Then the truck began to move, and the clinic receded behind us, and I closed my eyes and felt the motion of travel for the first time in almost 3 weeks. And I thought about Dr. Patel, wherever she was, and whether she had made it home, and whether her children were safe. I never found out. Not during the immediate aftermath, not during the processing at the evacuation center, not during the slow, grinding weeks of recovery in the secure zone. I asked. I searched the survivor registries. Her name wasn't on any of the lists. Not the living, not the confirmed dead. She existed in the gap between those 2 categories, in the vast, silent space of people who simply weren't accounted for. If I'm honest with myself, and this is a document of honesty if it's anything, I don't know if I made the right decisions. I know I made decisions that resulted in survival for the 5 people who were inside the clinic when rescue arrived. That's a measurable outcome. But I also know that we watched a family walk past without offering help. I know we listened to a woman die and did nothing. I know we let Dr. Patel walk into the unknown because stopping her felt like it wasn't my right. Each of those moments was a decision, and each decision had a cost that can't be calculated in the same way you calculate water rations or caloric intake. What I can say is this: survival in that situation was not about strength. It was not about courage or combat skill or any of the qualities that movies associate with staying alive when the world collapses. It was about position. It was about timing. It was about recognizing early enough that the smartest thing I could do was lock a door, stay behind it, and manage the small, unglamorous details that kept 5 people breathing for 19 days. It was about accepting that I couldn't save everyone, and that attempting to save everyone would have resulted in saving no one. The clinic is still there as far as I know. I haven't been back. I don't feel a particular need to see it again. It was a place that served a purpose during a specific period of time, and that period is over. I carry what happened there not as a story of heroism, but as a record of careful, sometimes painful, sometimes inadequate decision-making under conditions that didn't allow for certainty. Patricia still has the notebook. She showed it to me once, months later, in the resettlement area. The last entry, dated day 28, was written in her small, neat handwriting. It said, "Rescued. 5 survivors. Building intact. Supplies nearly depleted. We stayed, and it was enough." I think about that last line sometimes, not because it's triumphant or poetic, but because it's accurate. We stayed, and it was enough. Not perfect, not heroic, just enough. And in the end, enough is what survival actually looks like.